She was humiliated in front of dozens of guests, accused of something she didn't do. But what she didn't know was that someone who could change everything was watching in disguise. This isn't just a story about injustice. It's about courage, revenge, and a billionaire who couldn't ignore the truth. Stay with us, because what happens next will shock you. Richard Coleman had walked through the polished marble lobby countless times as the owner of the Grand Metropolitan Hotel, yet today he moved unnoticed. Clad in a maintenance worker's uniform with a cap pulled low and tools in hand, he blended seamlessly into the background. Guests passed him without a glance, unaware that the man they saw as just another staff member was the billionaire owner, a man who had built an empire along the East Coast over the past 2 decades. Today, he wasn't here to admire the chandeliers or inspect the service standards. He was here to see something he had been avoiding: truth. At the center of the lobby, a scene was unfolding that made Richard's chest tighten. Grace, a loyal black cleaning lady who had dedicated 15 years of her life to the hotel, stood frozen as manager James Morrison's voice rang out across the room. "People like you always find a way to take what isn't yours." He spat, his words echoing off the high ceilings and Italian marble as security officers moved toward her with suspicious eyes. The accusation was absurd. A guest claimed a diamond bracelet had gone missing, and in Morrison's eyes, Grace became the scapegoat. Her belongings were searched in front of the gathering crowd. Tourists filming on their phones, children pulled back by embarrassed parents, whispers bouncing like waves across the room. Despite the humiliation, Grace remained composed, her hands steady as she gathered herself, her eyes holding a quiet fire that belied the situation. Richard watched silently from his corner, the air heavy with a sense of injustice he had not felt in years. Then, as if sensing someone in the crowd, Grace lifted her tear-filled eyes and whispered 3 simple words. "You remind me." Richard froze. The sound was soft, almost lost in the murmurs of the room, but it struck him harder than any boardroom defeat or financial loss ever could. Those words transported him back decades to a life he had long tried to forget. He remembered the worn shoes and frayed shirts of his youth, growing up in the same neighborhoods as Grace, riding the same crowded buses to work, cleaning the same floors, dreaming of a life that seemed impossibly distant. He had been that boy, judged for the color of his skin, overlooked for his potential, yet fueled by a stubborn determination to rise above. And now, standing before him, was someone living the same struggles he had once endured, forced into silence, carrying dignity like armor against a world that sought to crush her spirit. Richard's heart pounded as he observed every movement Grace made, the careful way she collected her cleaning supplies, the measured steps she took to avoid attracting more attention, the subtle way she maintained her composure despite the whispers and stares. It was a testament to resilience that few could match. Morrison, meanwhile, treated the moment as routine, dismissing the truth with a shrug, convinced that he could control the narrative and silence anyone who challenged his authority. As Richard watched, the realization hit him. Morrison's behavior wasn't an isolated incident. It was systemic, part of a culture that allowed discrimination to fester unnoticed. Promotions withheld, impossible schedules assigned, offhand comments designed to demean. These weren't mistakes or misunderstandings. They were deliberate. And the victims, like Grace, bore the burden silently, their loyalty exploited, their dignity assaulted. For a moment, Richard considered stepping in immediately, revealing himself as the owner and ending the spectacle. But he knew that doing so would solve nothing in the long term. Morrison might be removed temporarily, but the underlying system would remain, hidden beneath the opulence of the hotel's image. No, to create lasting change, he needed more than a confrontation. He needed proof, evidence that could expose the patterns of prejudice and protect not just Grace, but countless others who suffered in silence. Grace finished gathering her supplies, holding herself with the quiet grace of someone accustomed to walking through fire without letting it consume her. She disappeared through the service door, her back straight, her head high, leaving behind a room full of guests and staff who had just witnessed an act of public degradation. Richard remained behind for a few moments, letting the impact of her words settle into his mind. He had seen courage before, but this was different. This was endurance, forged in silence, and it demanded action. That day marked the beginning of Richard Coleman's journey from passive observer to active advocate. He would spend the next several days uncovering Morrison's discriminatory practices, gathering evidence, and preparing to confront a problem that had festered for too long. But for now, all he could do was remember, feel, and make a silent promise. No one under his watch would be humiliated in silence again. Grace had reminded him not only of the struggles he had endured, but of the responsibility he now carried as someone in power to ensure justice was no longer optional. And as the lobby returned to its usual rhythm, with tourists snapping photos of the grand staircase and staff resuming their duties, Richard Coleman understood that the most important story he would ever be part of was just beginning. A story of courage, recognition, and a reckoning that would shake the foundations of his empire. Richard Coleman moved quietly through the bustling city streets, his maintenance uniform tucked under a modest overcoat, heading toward the small apartment he had rented just blocks from the Grand Metropolitan. It was a far cry from the penthouse suites he owned, but it was perfect for maintaining his cover. Here he could observe the inner workings of his hotel without drawing attention, noting the habits, interactions, and patterns that his managers might otherwise hide from a high-level inspection. The goal was simple yet monumental: uncover the truth about what was happening to his employees, especially those quietly enduring harassment and discrimination. Within hours of returning to the hotel in his guise, Richard began noticing patterns that chilled him. Schedules were disproportionately harsh for black employees, with double shifts, minimal breaks, and unrealistic cleaning quotas. Promotions seemed perpetually out of reach, with high-performing staff overlooked time and again. Offhand comments meant to demean and intimidate were casually thrown into conversations in full view of employees. The patterns were unmistakable, deliberate, and systematic. Each small incident, seemingly insignificant on its own, combined into a culture designed to oppress. Grace's professionalism shone in contrast. Despite Morrison's deliberate attempts to make her appear incompetent, she handled every challenge with dignity, mediating conflicts, covering shifts for coworkers, and preventing potential labor disputes with tact and calm authority. She wasn't just surviving, she was holding the team together. Richard watched as she quietly diffused a heated argument between two employees, her tone gentle yet firm, her presence commanding respect. It was clear she had become the glue of the staff, the one person who made the entire operation run smoothly despite Morrison's efforts to undermine her. Then Richard observed something more alarming. Morrison had begun a pattern that indicated a plan to fire Grace, orchestrating small failures and creating scenarios where she would appear negligent or dishonest. Every decision seemed designed to manufacture a cause for dismissal. He timed her workloads to be impossible to complete alone, assigned tasks without proper resources, and documented minor errors in a way that would be damning on paper. Richard felt a mix of anger and urgency. Grace had already endured years of such treatment, and the coming days could be decisive. Knowing he needed legal expertise, Richard made a call that connected him to Michael Torres, his college roommate and one of the country's most formidable civil rights lawyers. Michael had fought battles for systemic change long before Richard had entered the business world. The phone conversation was brief but precise. Richard summarized the evidence he had collected, the patterns of discrimination, the ongoing harassment, and Morrison's deliberate attempts to manufacture failure. Michael's voice carried a quiet excitement, the kind reserved for cases where justice and impact intersected. "Send me everything you have, Richard," he said. "We'll make sure she's protected, and he faces consequences." Over the next 3 days, Richard intensified his undercover work with meticulous precision. He discreetly installed recording devices in strategic locations within the hotel, common areas, hallways, and even manager offices where legal. He monitored internal emails, documented every biased comment, every unfair evaluation, every attempt to marginalize black staff. Every action Morrison took, unaware that the owner of the empire was watching, was captured. The level of evidence was staggering, revealing not just a series of bad decisions but a calculated system of oppression designed to humiliate and control employees. Meanwhile, Morrison escalated his harassment, oblivious to the fact that Richard was observing and recording everything. He doubled down on intimidation tactics, assigning Grace the most impossible tasks, questioning her competence in front of other staff, and spreading subtle rumors to undermine her credibility. Each act meant to break her spirit instead highlighted her resilience. Richard took careful notes, knowing that each piece of evidence would form the backbone of a legal case that could not be ignored. Richard also took the time to understand the broader implications of Morrison's behavior. It wasn't just one manager abusing his authority. It was a symptom of a larger problem within the company. Policies were misapplied, promotions were inequitable, and subtle prejudices had been normalized over the years. If he could expose Morrison, he could also begin to dismantle the systems that allowed such abuse to flourish, creating meaningful, lasting change. By the end of the third day, Richard had compiled a comprehensive dossier, audio recordings, email copies, documented schedules, testimonies, and observational notes. Each piece told the story of deliberate discrimination, moral harassment, and a hostile work environment. He could feel the weight of it, knowing that in a matter of days, the evidence would speak louder than anyone's assumptions, forcing accountability for the first time. And yet, amidst all the preparation and planning, Richard never lost sight of Grace. He continued to watch her every move, admiring the quiet strength she displayed in the face of relentless adversity. She had become more than a witness to injustice. She was the symbol of resilience, courage, and dignity, qualities that would soon ignite a reckoning. As the days unfolded, it became clear that Morrison was preparing for a grand humiliation, a public demonstration meant to discredit Grace completely. But Richard, armed with irrefutable evidence and a growing sense of purpose, was ready. Behind the scenes, a plan was forming that would not only expose Morrison's cruelty but also transform the very culture of the Grand Metropolitan Hotel. Every moment of observation, every note, every recording had been a step toward justice, and the moment of reckoning was fast approaching. Richard Coleman, billionaire and observer of injustice, had shifted from passive watcher to active protector, and for Grace, unknowingly, the storm gathering around Morrison would soon mark the beginning of a journey from humiliation to vindication. The morning light poured through the grand windows of the Grand Metropolitan Hotel, reflecting off crystal chandeliers and marble floors. As James Morrison prepared his next act of humiliation, he had announced a special demonstration, framed as a showcase of cleaning standards, but in reality, it was a calculated attempt to discredit Grace in front of the entire staff and high-profile investors. 30 luxury suites had been assigned to her alone, each with impossible deadlines, and every detail had been meticulously designed to ensure failure. Morrison's predatory smile revealed his confidence. He believed he had trapped Grace completely. Richard Coleman, still disguised as the maintenance worker John, watched from the sidelines, tools in hand but eyes sharp and calculating. Every instruction Morrison gave, every subtle dig, every impossible expectation was noted, recorded, and stored in the growing dossier of evidence. Richard had spent weeks gathering proof, and today all the pieces were ready. Grace moved with quiet determination, her hands steady and movements precise, despite the impossible workload. The tension in the room was palpable, with other employees watching nervously, unsure of how far Morrison's cruelty would go. Meanwhile, Richard prepared to act. He had already contacted Michael Torres, his college roommate and civil rights lawyer, who was waiting for the right moment to intervene. Every recording, email, and documented incident had been meticulously compiled. The plan was simple: allow Morrison to continue believing he was in control until the perfect moment, when the truth could be revealed in front of the entire audience. That moment came unexpectedly during an investor party held later that evening. Morrison, emboldened by the presence of influential guests, spoke openly about his views on black employees. "Old-timers like her are a problem," he said casually, unaware that the hotel's internal system and Richard's own surveillance devices were capturing every word. "You give them stability, and they start thinking they deserve respect. It's a matter of genetics. Really, I'm doing her a favor by keeping her employed." Gasps rippled through the room as some investors turned pale, recognizing the weight of what had just been said. Richard's hand tightened around the small tape recorder in his pocket, the culmination of weeks of covert observation. Richard decided it was time to end the charade. Stepping out of the shadows, he removed his cap and jacket, revealing his true identity as the billionaire owner of the hotel empire. Grace's eyes widened in astonishment, her shock giving way to a quiet relief as recognition dawned. John, the maintenance worker who had shown concern and subtly guided her, was Richard Coleman, the very person with the power to intervene. Michael Torres appeared beside him, briefcase in hand, prepared to take immediate legal action. The confrontation in the lobby was immediate and dramatic. Richard approached Morrison with calm authority, his voice carrying across the marble floors. "James, your actions over the past weeks have been observed, recorded, and documented. Every attempt to humiliate Grace, every act of discrimination, and every creation of a hostile environment has been preserved." He gestured to Michael, who distributed copies of the evidence to the investors and staff present. Recordings of conversations, emails, work schedules, and even Morrison's openly racist comments at the party were now visible for all to see. Morrison's confident demeanor crumbled, his face flushed with panic as he stammered, trying to deny the accusations, but the evidence was undeniable. Every piece of documentation, every recording, every witness corroborated the same truth. Morrison had systematically targeted Grace and other employees with prejudice and cruelty. Richard continued, "Your position of authority gave you power over others, but it did not grant you immunity from accountability. Today, that ends." Within minutes, Morrison was terminated for cause. Legal proceedings were initiated immediately, including filings for systematic discrimination, moral harassment, and defamation. Michael Torres explained the legal consequences to the stunned audience, emphasizing that Morrison's career in the hospitality industry was effectively over. The crowd watched in awe as someone who had wielded privilege to harm others was brought down by the very truth he had sought to hide. Grace, who had remained composed throughout the confrontation, finally spoke. "Thank you, Mr. Coleman," she said, her voice steady but emotional. "Thank you for seeing, for listening, and for acting when no one else would." The staff erupted in applause, many approaching her to offer congratulations and admiration. Employees who had once feared retaliation now looked at her with respect, inspired by her courage and dignity. Richard, standing beside her, felt a deep sense of fulfillment, not just for the justice served, but for the example set for the entire organization. The aftermath was immediate. The hotel's staff, once cautious and subdued, now experienced a renewed sense of empowerment. The culture of fear and oppression Morrison had fostered began to unravel. Richard had not only removed a toxic manager, but had also demonstrated that true authority comes from integrity and moral courage, not intimidation or prejudice. As the lobby settled back into its usual rhythm, the employees now understood a fundamental truth. Dignity, courage, and ethical leadership could triumph over arrogance and discrimination. Grace's perseverance had been the catalyst, and Richard's intervention had transformed her struggle into a landmark moment of justice, setting the stage for systemic changes that would impact the hotel and its employees for years to come. Months after the dramatic showdown, Grace Johnson stood at the center of Charleston's most elegant event hall. No longer a humble cleaning lady, but the newly appointed Director of Human Resources and Organizational Culture for the entire Hoffman Hotels network. The audience of business leaders, journalists, and employees listened intently as she spoke about the launch of the Second Chances program, a groundbreaking initiative designed to provide scholarships, mentoring, and professional opportunities to people from marginalized communities. Every word she spoke carried the weight of experience, resilience, and an unshakable belief in justice. Richard Coleman watched from the front row, pride evident in his expression. Over the past few months, he had overseen comprehensive reforms across his company, going beyond mere anti-discrimination policies. Diversity and inclusion protocols were fully implemented, internal communication channels made transparent, and clear reporting systems established to protect employees from harassment. Employees who had once endured years of subtle prejudice now felt empowered, heard, and valued. Promotions were no longer arbitrary, workloads fairer, and recognition based on merit. The transformation was tangible. Morale soared, employee satisfaction increased, and hotel revenue reflected the positive cultural shift. Grace's own journey became a model of leadership in action. Her promotion was more than a reward for her personal endurance. It was a statement that dignity and resilience could reshape entire organizations. She personally oversaw the Second Chances program, ensuring that scholarships reached talented students, mentoring programs were robust, and career opportunities extended to those previously overlooked. Linda, the cleaning supervisor who had witnessed Grace's humiliation, now led the employee training department. Carlos, the security guard who had always shown her respect, had been promoted to head of security with a significant pay increase. Every change reinforced the principle that fairness and empowerment were not just ethical imperatives but strategic advantages. Meanwhile, James Morrison faced the consequences of his actions in full view of the public. His attempts to maintain authority and respectability crumbled under the weight of documented evidence and public awareness. The videos of his racist remarks and humiliating behavior went viral, circulating widely on social media and across news platforms. Once a manager of influence, Morrison found himself unable to secure employment at reputable hotels. His name had become synonymous with discrimination and arrogance. Ultimately, he was forced to work as a receptionist at a small roadside motel, a humbling position far removed from the authority and prestige he had once wielded. His professional downfall served as a stark reminder that privilege and power, when abused, carry consequences that cannot be ignored. Grace's story began to inspire beyond the walls of the hotel. She was invited to speak at prestigious universities, corporate conferences, and diversity summits, sharing her experience of turning injustice into opportunity. Her narrative highlighted not just personal triumph, but the importance of systemic change, ethical leadership, and moral courage. Audiences were captivated by her ability to transform humiliation into advocacy, adversity into empowerment. Grace emphasized that real leadership does not rely on titles or power, but on the ability to recognize injustice and act decisively to create lasting impact. Richard and Grace often reflected on the lessons learned from the ordeal. In quiet moments overlooking the city skyline, they discussed how a single act of observation, combined with moral courage, could ripple outward to effect profound change. "Grace," Richard said, "you reminded me of where I came from, of the responsibility that comes with privilege. This company is stronger and fairer because of your resilience." Grace smiled, acknowledging that her struggle had become the catalyst for transformation. Together, they had redefined what leadership could look like, one that prioritized inclusion, dignity, and accountability over hierarchy or personal gain. The Second Chances program expanded beyond the hospitality sector, inspiring other corporations to adopt similar initiatives. Partnerships with historically Black universities were established, and youth from underserved communities gained access to mentorship and training that had previously been unavailable. The program's success was evident not only in the measurable metrics of employee satisfaction and retention, but in the stories of individuals whose lives had been changed through opportunity, respect, and empowerment. Grace's vision had become a blueprint for systemic reform, demonstrating that ethical leadership could yield tangible, far-reaching results. The Hoffman Hotels network thrived as a result of these changes. Revenue increased by 15%, employee turnover dropped dramatically, and the company's reputation as an inclusive and socially responsible organization attracted both exceptional talent and conscientious customers. Grace had become a national figure, her influence extending far beyond the confines of hotel operations. embodying the principle that true victory lies not in defeating individuals but in transforming environments, systems, and opportunities for the better. As the evening of the awards ceremony concluded, Grace and Richard stood side by side, representing a partnership built on trust, courage, and shared purpose. "This award," Grace declared, "belongs to every employee who had the courage to speak out, and to those who refuse to accept that injustice is inevitable." Richard added, "True leadership is not about power over others, but using your influence to lift others up. Today, our company proves that dignity, courage, and inclusion are not just moral choices. They are the foundation for lasting success." In the end, the Grand Metropolitan Hotel displayed a commemorative plaque in the main lobby, honoring employees who faced discrimination silently and celebrating those who, like Grace, transformed adversity into progress. Grace Johnson's legacy had become a living testament to resilience, moral courage, and systemic change. Morrison's downfall and Grace's triumph illustrated a timeless lesson. True victory is not in destroying an enemy, but in building a better, fairer world where dignity and opportunity are available to all. The story of Grace and Richard serves as a reminder that justice, when paired with courage and deliberate action, can reshape lives, organizations, and society itself.